we're now ready to transition into our next language, quote unquote. We've explored HTML fairly completely at this point. You've seen all of the basics, but that's not to say we're experts. There's much more to it than what we've seen so far. I'd encourage you, if you want to explore the other ends of it, to go check out W3 Schools and see what else they can offer there. For now, we're going to move on to style sheets, or cascading style sheets, CSS. To get started with this, I've gone back here to what was called example 3. This was that table that we created when we were exploring table tags. This is what it looked like here. I've zoomed in on it a little bit so you can see it nice in the video, but otherwise this is exactly what we get when we render this. I want to work from this. This is what we'll use to explore our styles. So I'm going to copy all of this. I do Command A, Control A if you're on Windows, and then Command C to copy it. And then I'm going to do Command N and Command V to paste. And that gets me a new file with all that in there. All I have to do is save it. So we're up to example 7 here. And there we are. We might want to adjust this a little bit. I'm going to now call this styling HTML and styles for tables. Table styles. How many different ways can I say the same thing here? We've clearly got too many titles on this page. All right, let's save that. And let me go ahead and make sure that's what we're looking at in the browser now. You'll remember all we have to do is come up here and change this from 3 to, what was it, 7? Yeah, 7. There we go. Styles for tables, styling HTML. There we go. We've got it all in there. So, like I said, what we're learning now is a new language called CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So let's talk about the basics of exactly what CSS is. As I alluded to, this is a whole new language here. And inside the browser environment, when we're doing web programming, there are really 3 different languages that we're working with. The first one, the one that we already went through, is HTML. We have Hypertext Markup Language, that's what that stands for. And we're working with version 5, which is essentially the latest version. The next one that people usually learn is CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets. And the latest one of that is version 3. That's what we'll be essentially working with. The third language that runs in the browser, aka client side, remember, is something called ECMA Script. ECMA is just an acronym. It stands for European Computer Manufacturers Association. These are the people that standardized that scripting language that we all know as JavaScript. Now, technically, JavaScript is an implementation of ECMA script, and there are other ones. There's JScript, there's VBScript. None of the other ones have any popularity anymore. These days, everybody works with JavaScript, but the standard that defines how the language works is ECMA script, and sometimes it's just called ES for short. The version we're going to be working with, and that's supported in most browsers, is version 5.1. However, the latest version is in fact further along with that. It's called, it's version 6, ES6, but once they went to that, they decided to start naming them by the years that they were ratified or adopted. And so it's actually called ES 2015 nowadays. Most browsers do not fully support ES 2015. They support some parts of it, and where I think it's appropriate, we'll learn that. But for practical purposes, I'm just going to call this browser JavaScript, because we're going to just try and target what's supported by most browsers. Now, all that being said, that's not what this section is about. JavaScript is what's going to be happening in Unit 2. Right now I bring it up only because I want to give you that complete picture of the 3 languages that work together. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or ECMA script. Now, here are those 3 languages all laid out for us. They have 3 really important aspects to them that we want to think about. They all serve slightly different purposes when it comes to the design of your web page. We're going to break the design down into 3 key things. The first thing, our first sort of design paradigm here, to use a kind of key term, is intention, or if we want to be really precise, semantic meaning. So if we think about the things that are on our page, we want to be able to communicate to the browser what our intention is with each of those elements. This is what we've already been doing with HTML. Whenever we put a tag around something, we're telling the computer what we intended, and that is more precisely referred to as its semantics, its semantic meaning. So we want to, we've already been delving into that. An important thing to note about this is it's essentially static. You can't really, you set it all and it just stays how it is throughout the life of the web page, i.e. as you're visiting it, examining the web page in the browser, it doesn't really change. Now it will appear to change later, but it's not going to change through the original meaning. It's going to change through other things. Now the second design idea would be the style or the layout of the web. So this is going to be where things are positioned and what they look like. This is different from the meaning. We told it before that it was a paragraph, but we didn't tell it what we wanted paragraphs to look like. That's kind of the idea. The style and layout should happen separately. This portion is going to be a mixture of both static things and dynamic things. It's going to be able to do both. So it will both be able to sit there and just be a part of our web page, but it will also be able to change over time as the user interacts with it, and we'll see a little bit of that. The last design is control and interaction. This is where the user can actually interact with the items on our web page, and then it can they can control it and do dynamic things that happen over time. And as I suggest here, this is really where it becomes fully dynamic. Now, probably not too surprisingly, these line up very nicely with the languages. HTML describes the intention. That's where we get our semantic meaning of our content. CSS, Cascading Style Sheets, is going to describe, not surprisingly, the style, and that includes the layout of the page and give us some control over that. It's also going to allow us to let things be a little bit dynamic. We can't do that with just pure HTML. Lastly, JavaScript is going to give us full dynamic control. It's going to allow us to really make our web pages pop. That's what we'll be getting into in Unit 2. Today, we're going to focus on this middle one, CSS. Always keep these three things in mind. First, intention, we've already done. We want all of the intention to be expressed in the HTML and nowhere else. And really, that's our only option. That's kind of where things begin. Next, didn't mean to go forward yet. We want to talk about the style and the layout, or really just the styling of the page. That is going to be expressed entirely in CSS, but we have to be careful here. If we don't do it right, it can sometimes get lost inside the HTML, and so that's why I bring it up. Always be thinking about keeping your style only in the CSS. Lastly, we will have control and interaction happening with the JavaScript. And this is where things get really sticky. If you're not careful, JavaScript can be scattered all throughout your HTML. It can contain within it more CSS and more HTML. It can really start to mix into lots of strange things, and we don't want to make that happen if we can help it. So that's where we'll really have to be careful about trying to keep these three design paradigms neatly separated. We'd like to be able to draw neat lines between them and say, here's where the control and interaction is happening, here's where the style is happening, and here's where we're assigning meaning. And if they start to blend together, if those lines get blurry, it's going to make your life harder. So I always like to try and use these three languages to draw those lines. As long as we keep the three things in their languages, life will be easier. So let's take a look at CSS now. We're going to focus on this middle one. We've already gotten a good introduction to the first one. The middle one is where we want to be now. Let's talk about how we describe style and layout and how we keep it neatly separated from HTML. What we're looking at here is the syntax of what I like to call a CSS rule. This is a style rule. The syntax here it's not as flexible as the syntax of a language like JavaScript or C or C++, but it will look kind of like it. You'll notice we've got curly braces, we've got semicolons, things that kind of look familiar. That's not, or that is actually kind of on purpose. They want to attach to things that you as a programmer might already know. When we look at the bigger structure, it always starts first with a selector, and then you'll have a big block as defined by the curly braces, and there will always be one block after a selector. We'll spend more time getting into selectors in just a moment. Right now, let's focus on the block. Inside the block, you have a list of declarations, and declarations are separated by semicolons. That's a little different from C++ or JavaScript or other C-like languages. They usually, when they have a list, they separate things by commas. So note, each rule ends with a semicolon, and that's how we keep them separated from one another. Or, excuse me, each declaration inside a rule. So the selector itself allows you to pick which elements the rule applies to. You can see here, this one says H1. That means this is going to apply to all H1 tags. But we'll see, the selector is in fact really versatile, and it can get really complicated. Declarations are the things that actually specify the styles you're setting. And you can kind of see that here as you look at them. Declarations always consist of two parts. First, a property, and that is the actual attribute of the element you're trying to set. Usually this is some sort of visual style or placement attribute. Then you get a colon, and after the colon you get a value, and that's the thing you're trying to set it to. Not too surprising. It's very similar to having attribute equals something inside of a tag, and in fact there will be a certain one-to-one relationship between those going on here. So every time you have a property, in this case we want to set its color, and then its value, you give it some sort of value it understands. It sets the color to blue. Here we have another one, font size to 12px, 12 pixels. So we are taking our H1 here and saying make them all blue and make them all 12 pixels. That will affect every single H1 tag in our page and apply that style to it. So let's go play around with this a little bit. Let's come to our page that we just set up. Let's come in here and try and apply some styles. Now remember, we actually did apply some styles already right up here, and we'll get to those in just a moment. But for now, let's do what it was just suggesting. Here we are, and we're going to go right to the H1 tag. And to specify style rules here, we can avoid talking about the selectors by going right to the tag. If you're inside the tag, you don't have to use the selector. You can just put in definitions, rules. To do this, you give it a style attribute, and you say equals, and just like we always do, it always equals a string. And in here, we can put declarations. So here's one declaration, here's another declaration. Let's just write those right into the style. We don't need the curly braces, we don't need the selector. We're already in an H1 tag. And so we can just go right to the declarations. Whenever you're writing it right into a style attribute, that's what you do. So we'll say color is blue. And then always put that semicolon at the end of your rule. Let's save that, and let's go take a look at it. Refresh. There we go. We just made this one blue up there. Notice it only affected this. That's not surprising. That's the only H1 we actually have in the on the page. Let's go ahead and make another H1. If we do it this way, let's delete out the style on the second H1. It's only going to apply to the one that's included in. So here we have styles for table, styles are fun. Only the first one became blue. That should make sense. We put it right in the tag itself. It only affects that one tag. Let's go ahead and put in the other one. So font size, we said 12px. I imagine we'll make it smaller than it was, because 12px is not that big. Notice here, I separate them, putting a semicolon after each one, but I don't put in those curly braces. There it goes. That shrunk it down big time. This gives us a nice sort of basic layout, a way to control an individual tag and affect its style. That's all we're doing here. Now, we can do that in a lot of different ways. Some of the things that we did up here, we said for every table we wanted it to have border collapse. That's just an attribute that applies to tables. Well, I could have come down here and actually done this here. Style equals border collapse. And again, I'm just putting the declaration of the rule in there where I say, here's the style I'm trying to control, the attribute, and then here's its value. I want them to collapse. And remember, this is what causes the table to shrink down the line so that there's only one line between each cell, so cells share adjacent lines. If I do that, nothing actually changes. Let's see what that actually looks like here. We can do this. Oh, geez, don't do that. And then we'll do this. Just comment out, well, not the whole thing. Close enough. It's always hard to do, commenting inside of HTML. There we go. So here we've taken that style out completely. Let's remind ourselves of what it looks like without the collapse. There we go. You can see there's a border around each cell, and they don't share their adjacent borders, and there's a border around the whole table too. But when we put the border collapse style back in there, it all shrinks down to just be one line. They share adjacent borders. We could also do that to all these other things, but in fact, that doesn't achieve what we want. So this is the simplest way to do styling. We can just put it right inside the tag, and when we do that, it affects that one tag and that one tag only. It gives you some very fine-grained control. Now let's think about exactly how we can do this. So there's really, let me see here. I can go back into present mode. So we haven't talked about selectors yet, but we did write in some declarations directly inside tags, and that's a good way to begin. Now, let's start talking about selectors. Selectors get a little bit more complicated, and there's something that's kind of brand new, but they're very important. They get used, they were really defined as part of CSS originally, as part of that language, but you will find they get used a lot of other places. We'll eventually see that we can use these inside of JavaScript to select out elements that we want to do dynamic things to, that we want to program. So it's important that you understand the basics of them. Unless you're going to get really sophisticated with design, you don't have to go real deep into these, and you can. It is a very deep rabbit hole. That is important in other classes such as interactive design or graphic design, and you can learn more about them there. For our purposes, let's just get the basics out of the way. First of all, you can select a tag by its name being something like h1 or table, the actual word that you type when you specify the tag. When you do that, all tags with that name will be selected. This is what we're doing up here at the top. So I'm specifying that I want table, th, and td to all receive this property right here, that they will have a border that's 1 pixel thick, that is solid, and that it's black. Let's go ahead and write one right now that applies to all h1 tags. Now again, I'm going to go ahead and use the curly braces after that. After selector, you always want to include curly braces. You create a block, and inside that block is where we will then put our rules. That's the one key difference between putting it in as a style attribute. As a style attribute, you go right to the declarations. But when you're putting it up here in the head underneath a style tag, you have to first start with the selector and the block. Let's then grab these two, pull them out, and put it here. We're going to then delete the style property right here. So now I've specified h1 as the selector, and that's going to pick out all tags with the h1 name, every single one of them, and apply the color blue and the font size 12 pixels. Now remember, previously we had only our first h1 getting that style because it was right in the tag. Now both of them get it applied to it. So that's what happens differently because of the use of a selector rather than putting it right in the tag. Let's go ahead and restore the one we did for the table. For the table, I want to be able to apply this border collapse. That's exactly how we had it before. And this really is a more reasonable place to put it. And we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. This selects the table. And by doing that, really nothing's going to change. It'll still look the same, but we wind up with that. Now, sometimes you would like to apply it to a specific tag, but you don't necessarily want to write it right in line. Remember what I talked about a moment ago about separation of design paradigms? We'd really like all of our styling to be included in the CSS and none of it to show up inside the HTML. Well, if I come down here and write it into here, style equals something, and put some sort of rule right in there, it's embedded in the middle of our HTML. That's not good separation of design. We really want to avoid that because it's going to make it harder to maintain this down the road. So, generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is that you want to avoid doing it like this and instead keep it up inside of the style. But how do I then avoid applying this to every single h1 tag? Well, for that, we have classes and IDs. We've done a little bit with IDs already. Every single tag can be given an ID if you want. Let's go ahead and give this first one an ID of first header. You can call the ID anything you want that is a string. It can include dashes if you'd like, but not spaces. Don't put a space in there. And usually a good rule of thumb is to name these the same way you would name variables. I highly recommend that. And so remember, the rules for variables are they can include letters and numbers, they must start with a letter, and they can also include underscore characters, but not dashes. So you wouldn't be able to put a dash, but you would be able to put an underscore. That's what I recommend, so it will play well later on when we use it in other JavaScript areas. My preference is for camel case. We still always start with a lowercase letter, but every time a new word appears, capitalize that letter so that you can see the separate words. So now I've given this an ID of first header, and let's say I only want to adjust the style of that one and not the second H1. Here in a selector, I can also specify things by their ID, but I need to inform CSS that it's an ID. To do that, we put a special character on the front. We put the # or hashtag symbol. Hashtag followed by some string means this is an ID, and everything with this ID needs to have this style applied to it. So let's save that, and now let's go back to our page and see how it's changed. There. So the first one that has that ID is getting that style applied to it. The second one is not. So this gives me more control. Now I can go one step further with that. This is IDs. The important thing to remember about IDs is that they are unique. You cannot have two elements or tags with the same ID. You must only have one. Sometimes you'd like to group your elements together so that the same style is applied to all of them. Let's say I'd like to have this style applied to both of these. Well, if I try and give it the same ID, it's going to complain. Right here, it throws an error. It says duplicate ID first header. Let's pull this up so we can see both the errors. It tells me there were errors, and it says right here, duplicate ID first header. And it even tells me back here, here's where that happened. The first occurrence happened here. Now, technically, I could save this and go ahead and try and render it. We'll do that. If I come back here and refresh, you'll notice it works, but I've broken rules. I really shouldn't be doing that. I can't count on this working all the time. And you'll find, in fact, once we use IDs in JavaScript, this would break it. So this is bad practice. We can't do this even though it works. So don't trust it just because it worked. Pay attention to those errors that it showed you. So we can't use IDs to do this. Let's instead use a class. We'll say class equals, and let's say blue header. This means that I want to apply whatever styles are associated with the class blue header, and I want to apply it to both the first one and the second one here, so that both of these H1s get treated as quote-unquote blue headers. Now I just need to create that class up here, blue header, and give it some styles. Let's pull this one in. What else could we do? Let's do border 1px solid light. Let's just do 1px solid gray. We'll give it a gray color there. So I'm going to put a border around those blue headers as well, just so we can see that they're distinct from first header. Now remember, if I include something without anything on the front, that should be a tag name. If I put the pound or hashtag on the front of it, it should be an ID. We have something similar for classes. For classes, we put a period on the front of it, so that it says everything that has the class blue header. Let's save this, and then let's go take a look at it and see what it does. There we go. You can see it picked it up. So it grabbed that style for both of the headers that are in our classes. Put the border around it. That border is gray, even though it looks kind of black. It's just a little bit lighter of black. And it grabbed those for both of the elements without having to specify H1. Both of them are allowed to have the same class. Now, here's something interesting. I also have ID first header on H1. Very quickly, you will find that you start to get conflicting rules. They call them cascading style sheets because the rules sort of cascade down to be more and more specific. let's play around with this a little bit. Let's change the color here to red. So we're saying for the first header, make it red and make it 12 pixels. For blue header classes, make them blue 12 pixels, one with a gray border around them. What's it going to do? First of all, try and think about the first H1. It's part of the blue header class, but it's also got the first header ID. So there's two different kinds of styles being applied to it. The second H1 is part of the blue header class. That one should be a little easier to predict because it's just going to get those one sets of styles. My real question is, will this first one be red or will it be blue? You might already know the answer to that. Here's what I would recommend to be your sort of guiding thought about this. Instead of trying to guess, simply think this way. The most specific rule is the one that will be picked up. And they will be picked up in that order. So it starts with more general rules. So it would start by applying any rules that are applied to all H1s. Then it would go to things that are applied to blue header and apply those rules. And then it'll go to things that are applied specifically to an ID, because IDs are as specific as you can get. That means they will all be applied, but they'll be applied in order. And the last one applied will take precedence. Hopefully, it'll be red. Let's see. It is. Now notice here, it still has the border around it, so it is picking up the blue header one. And for a brief moment in time there, it was blue, but we didn't see that because it immediately got overridden by being red. We could also override the pixel size. Let's make it a little bit bigger for the font size. And you'll notice that it then picks up the larger font, but the border does not go away. Once the border's there, it stays unless we were to remove it. We could override border up here with something different to get rid of that border, but it gets picked up by the class and it will stay there unless it gets overridden. Now this gets really complicated. You'll eventually have elements that have many different classes applied to them, more than one class. You can do that. Ones that have a style applied by ID, ones that have a style applied by name. It is a very complex system. So be prepared to think it through and to test a lot to make sure you get exactly the result that you want. Now the last thing I want to talk about here, we've gone through all of these now, so briefly here. These are the three main things that you'll want to be able to know how to do when you're dealing with CSS. Being able to select tags by name, noticing that that will select all tags with that name. Be able to select tags by class, which will select all tags with that class attribute, which can be a smaller set than ones with that name. It can actually select more than one type of tag if you just give them all the same class. And then finally selecting a tag by ID. That will always select one tag, assuming your HTML is properly defined. We're going to have to assume that you never accidentally gave two tags the same ID. And of course, if you have your linter working correctly, it will warn you when you do that. You should never do that. Selectors can get very complex. Here's where I'm going to send you in order to get more information about this. This is the full CSS reference that's available on W3 Schools. And let's go ahead and pull this up. There is a lot you can do this. The very first thing you see here, we have class selector, ID selector, and then right here, element selector allows you to select specific elements. Some other ones that are important to note here, especially this one, is that you can select multiple elements, just separate them by commas. You'll also find that you can start combining these things in really creative ways. You can also start doing things called pseudo classes, which are interesting. This is all very complicated. I don't actually want to delve into this too far. The one place I would really like you to go is here. This one little section here, CSS Selector Tester. In here, you will see a whole bunch of HTML that's set up and nice and neat. It even shows you the HTML in gray back there for the page. And over here, different selectors. You can click one of these and see what it selects. So H1. You can see the only H1 on the page is Welcome to my homepage, and it tells you it selects all H1 elements. Let's see, we go to something that is H1, comma P. That's going to select both the H1. Let's do that again. H1, comma P. There we go. It's going to select both the H1 and then all of the P elements as well. So it selects all of those. Now, there's other more complex ones here that I would leave for you guys to explore. One thing that is useful would be nth child odd. This is going to select TRs that are the nth child. So the nth being some number in the list of children. And if you do odd, notice it selects every other one here. If you do even, it does the others. This is a really useful thing. It allows you to sort of select alternating rows in a table. Really cool. So keep that in mind. That's one that I want you to play with eventually. It's just too useful to not make use of. You can also give it a particular sort of number here. So if I do to child of li here are all the li's. Notice that selects the second one. Nth child 1 would select that one. Now last child just goes backwards, so it counts from the bottom on up. Nth last child would be the first one counting backwards. And if they'd done one that was 2, it would go up to Daisy here. So play with this. Make sure you recognize everything that's in here and make some use of it. This is a really useful page, I think, for understanding more complex selectors. You don't need to know all of this. Focus on the ones that I sort of went through here. I would also recommend going through these as well and understanding what it is to have those parentheses around there. If we come back here, you can see this is a way to select an element with a particular attribute. And so remember, attributes are those value equals something that you can put inside, or excuse me, property equals value things that you can put inside of a page, or it's inside of a tag. So here it says select everything that has an ID attribute. And so this one has an ID, this one has an ID. It doesn't care what that ID is, it just selects everything that has an ID. Here this says select everything that has an ID equal to my address. Now that's a little bit silly. Of course, we could have selected that just by doing hashtag my-address, but nonetheless, it works. It's just another way to do that. Here's a really clever one. This says select everyone with a title that contains the word beautiful. That's a kind of a cool, powerful thing you can do here. So this goes in and finds this one. It has a title equal to Hello Beautiful, and it has the word beautiful in it. So it selects that one element. That's kind of a cool one. All right. So play around with these a little bit. Maybe go through, just make sure you understand how each of these are working before you let it all go. But you don't need to commit all these to memory. These get pretty complex. And whenever I'm going for ones that are more complicated than just a class, an ID, or an element, I will usually cue you to it and give you some help on how to understand what it's doing. Make sure you can understand those when you see them. That's the main thing. Now the last thing we should talk about is where these go. We've already seen two options. Where can we specify the rules? Well, first we can put it right in the tag in a style attribute. And when you do that, remember all you need is the definite or the declaration. You don't need the selector or the block, just the list of declarations. You can also put it in a style tag inside the head of the HTML file. That's the other thing we've been doing. So up here I have a style tag. The style tag always goes in the head, and I like to put it after the title. That will get us all of these styles sort of in this one block. Technically, you can have multiple style blocks if you want to. Maybe if multiple people were working on the same file and they had their own ideas, they could keep them separate that way. But most of the time, we'll just have the one style block up at the top when we're doing it that way. This is definitely preferred over putting it inline. But there's one thing that's even better. The last thing we could do is we could put it in a separate CSS file altogether. Let's take a look at doing it that way. I'm going to create a new file, just Command-N here. I'm going to save this as example7.css, where example7 here just matches the name of the file. So example7.html, I'm going to have it be example7.css. Now technically you can name it anything you want, but it's pretty common practice to give it the same name as the HTML file. I'm going to now grab all of this, just the stuff between the style tag, not the style tag itself, and I'm going to put it in here. This file contains CSS only, no HTML. You'll eventually find no JavaScript it can have. This keeps it truly separate so that the idea doesn't even mingle with the semantics at all. Here, design style and layout is its own thing truly. All we have to do now is figure out how to get it back in here. Well, like I mentioned, we have the link tag for that. Now, the link tag takes a little bit of understanding to really make it work right. Let's go look this up on W3 Schools to see exactly how the link tag works best. So let's just search here for HTML link. Okay, here we go. Let's see if it'll get us to the link tag. HTML link tag. You know, watch out for these earlier ones. HTML link tag, that's what we want. So a link tag helps you to link in an external resource or document. And really the only thing it's used for in modern practice is to link in external style sheets. Here it is right here. It's a little bit complicated because you have to do two things. You have to define what its relationship is, REL. And so this specifies the relationship between the current document and the linked document. And there are many defined, but the only one we ever really use is a style sheet. So all you have to do is make sure you include rel equals style sheet. And like I said, it is required. It's not proper HTML if you don't do that. Then we just need to point it to the actual thing, and this is called href. Now be careful here. Href here should be the name of the file, and we're assuming that it is in the same directory as the HTML. If it wasn't, we'd have to include the directory name before this here, but very typically they are just sitting in the same directory like this. Notice too, this is a self-closing tag. It'll do that for you automatically when you close it out. Now, as we do this, we should still get the same thing we did before. Let's refresh this. Oh, it lost it. Why did it lose it? Let's see here. So, inspect element. Notice we lost all our styles. And what does it say? Requested URL was not found on this server. Oh, well, because I misspelled it. Example.css is example7.css. Let's try that again. Refresh. There it is. Now it's got it. Now, you'll also note here, if you go look at all the files that have been loaded, in this case, resources is where it is, there's two files. Example7.css is separate. Example7.html has just the HTML in it. I would strongly encourage you to do it this way. Inline styling, it's really a bad idea. There are times when it just makes sense, when styling is not a big part of your job, but you still need to do some to put it in line. Like what we did with tables. The default layout or the default styling of tables are really awful. That's a case where I would not at all mind if you just put it in line in the one table you have on your page. But if you are really doing styling right, you should never put them in line. Now it's better to bring them up to the top of the file inside a style tag. Here they're at least separated and all the CSS is in one place. But really the best practice, the one that is recommended by all major programming standards, is to put it in its own file and link it in. It's also worth noting, you can link in more than one file. You can just keep including links, and they will be processed in the order that they're listed here. So if you have ones that you want to take precedence, list them later. So the ones that are the most specific and most important should come at the end, the last one you include, because they're included in and applied in order. All right, so that's all the basics about CSS. There'll be some more about advanced CSS usage in a future video. But for now, if you haven't already done the reading, go read in the textbook to sort of enhance what we've talked about here, and we'll keep moving forward.